Good evening all, and welcome. Tonight, we are going to be investigating stories of strange creatures, skinwalkers, and wendigos. You're in for a real treat, so be sure to get comfortable, to let the darkness take control. I work in wildland firefighting with the Forest Service. This isn't my story, but rather a story from an old supervisor of mine that I believe completely. Setting is 2004, Hell's Canyon area of Middle Ohio. His crew had been working all day on an emerging incident and were going to be working through the night as well. Being the assistant superintendent of the crew, second in charge, he was out ahead scouting on an ATV or some such. He was working his way down a logging road that clearly had not been used in some time, when a bobcat, or lynx, appears in the middle of the road, but doesn't run away as it usually would. This thing stands there for a good 10 seconds, screams at him, and scampers up a tree not 5 feet off the road. He finds this odd, but not particularly unsettling. Just a half mile or so down the road, he finds a small cabin. Also odd, as this is federal land and no private structure should be there. Upon investigation, all the windows had been boarded shut tight, and someone had done a good job of doing so. The door now had been punched out and secured to a hole drill into the log frame by a chain. Someone did not want anything getting in or out. Peering through the hole in the door, he can see that everything in the house is upset. This has him kind of unsettled, so he hops onto his ATV and heads back up the road. Well, here's where it gets really interesting. Right where the bobcat had been, there stands a Native American woman in a badly tattered nightgown and bare feet, just standing there. He yells at her, asking if she needs help. She just screamed at him, the same scream as the cat from before, and climbs right up a tree faster than any human has a right to be climbing. Obviously, he nopes out of there as fast as he can, unsure of who or what he just saw. He asks a local guy about the cabin, and after asking around a little, a local Native American hears them talking and informs them that they saw a pumawa, excuse the butchered pronunciation. In effect, a skin changer, a warg, a skinwalker. Now I would not believe most people that tried to tell me that, but this was a serious man that did not mess around. He was dead serious the 2 times I heard him tell it, and I 100% believe in what he saw. Some backstory. My boyfriend and I just bought our first house in June, on a lake about an hour northeast of Seattle. Aside from the lake community we're part of, there really isn't a large population around here. We're in between a few larger towns, but they're all about a 20-minute drive from where we live. Our house is backed up right against the Cascade Mountains. We're pretty much the last bit of population before the mountains begin. About 30 yards from our driveway is a dead-end road that turns off the main lake road and goes back into the woods a few miles. There are a few gated forest/logging roads that branch from this way. The boyfriend and I ride our dirt bikes up these roads, and they themselves go on for miles. But there really aren't any other houses in the area, except for a few that are all on the main dead-end road. Before taking the dirt bikes up it, I had walked up this road a few times, exploring the area, and it always felt a little odd to me. My boyfriend had said things like, "This road is creepy even in broad daylight." It totally Could have been that it was just very wooded in most spots and therefore shaded, and the lack of houses made it odd. But I stopped walking up this road for this reason. When we moved in, I was dog-sitting my friend's pit bull, Bella. She was about 70 pounds and totally fearless. She was kind of aggressive with other dogs and even with some people. I would walk up to her in the dead-end road pretty often while I had her, because there were hardly any houses and no traffic. One day, we were about 2 miles up the road and had come down a small hill onto a flat, treeless area, where there was an old abandoned barn and a large field that the road cut through. There was tall grass on either side of the road, and when we got to the area, Bella's tail went down, and she just kept her head really low. She also started to look around and back behind us, just acting nervous, which was odd for her. As we're coming to a turn, about 100 yards in front of us was this logging road that went off the road and straight up a hill. It had a large gate at the bottom to keep vehicles out. My boyfriend and I had put our dirt bikes under this gate before to go riding up on the trails, so I know how tall it is. The top bar of the gate comes to my chest, and I'm about 5'5". What I saw still scares me to this day. Standing right in front of this gate was a creature. It resembled a huge black dog. It was standing broadside with its head low, and I'm almost positive it was looking towards us, because I couldn't make out a snout or ears. I couldn't see a tail either, but it may have been lowered between its hind legs. The shoulders of this thing were higher than the top bar of the gate, because it was blocking part of its view. I stopped instantly and held Bella's harness so she couldn't advance forward anymore and catch sight of this thing, because aggressive dog problems. I looked at this thing for probably 2 seconds total before turning back and hauling arse back up the road, because I heard the thing growl. 100 yards away from it, and I heard the thing growl, this awful, hissing sounding growl. I was totally terrified at this, and so was Bella. It was a long 2 miles back, and I couldn't stop looking over my shoulder, and Bella was also freaked out the whole time. The growling, massive black dog thing wasn't the only thing I was terrified of. I also had this awful, awful feeling of fear and dread come over me when I saw it. It was overwhelming, and I'd never felt something like it. Even just trying to remember this in detail makes me feel jumpy. It took me a long time to feel okay and safe in our new house, especially at night. Even now, I have a really hard time when I'm alone. My boyfriend is 100% sure I saw a black bear. I did not see a bear. I grew up in rural Pennsylvania and have seen more black bears than he'll probably see in his entire life. This thing had long, skinny legs and a deeply curved rib cage and belly similar to a Doberman. Wolves don't live in this area, and even if they did, they wouldn't have been abnormally large and skinny wolves. Now, listening to this channel, I've come across Skinwalker encounters. I'm pretty much lost myself when I compared the similarities. I'm beginning to become more and more convinced that what I saw wasn't a normal, natural thing. My grandmother on my mother's side has always been very superstitious. For lack of a better word, she's not religious, but she does believe in a lot of paranormal stuff. Her mother was full-blooded Navajo, and her father was Irish. Either way, she'd never been anywhere east of Montana, and she grew up in Nevada. One year, when I was in grade school, we went to visit her. Most of the visit was pretty uneventful. Typical boring old people stuff, except she always kept her curtains drawn, and would always peek out the window. And when someone asked what she was doing, she would simply reply, "Yendalushi is watching me." This went on for nearly the entire visit, until a few days before we were due to leave. My grandmother and then baby brother were in the front yard that evening, planting flowers, when all of a sudden, she shouts, "Nigel, get away from that creature, it's not safe." Of course, being in Nevada, we all assumed that my brother had found a scorpion or rattlesnake, so we all run outside to see my grandmother, clutching my little brother and shaking in terror against the side of the house, standing out in the yard, with a large, black, Great Dane-sized dog. It was staring at my grandmother with an intensity I'd never seen before. It looked up at us and gave a little huff and bounded off. I don't remember if it moved unusually fast or not, but I do remember it had really deep yellow eyes. When my mother asked my grandmother what happened, she just kept repeating, "The Yenaldushi found me," and she moved a couple of weeks after that. So before I ever had these encounters, I didn't really believe much in the paranormal. I had a small fascination for it, but I never really truly believed in supernatural beings until these few odd occurrences. I currently date my fiancée, and she's a Native American. We'll call her Sarah. A few years ago, when we first started dating, we kept that a secret, as her mother disapproved of any of her children dating at a young age. That led us to go sneaking out at night to seek each other. I'd always leave my house at 9 or 10, only to sneak back home at around 1. Before I continue, I should give you a layout of our area. The distance between my house and her house is not that far away, but to get there it's pretty damn scary. Our houses are separated by a large highway, and every night I either take a shortcut through a dirt path along the highway next to an old railroad, which is completely pitch black by the way, or take the long route through my high school, which is well lit, and makes the uneasy feeling of being out late not so bad. Anyway, when we go out and talk at night, she would always jump to the topic of the paranormal, stating that she could hear the dead speak, and various encounters with a shadow man when she was young. I just humoured her, and joked around with saying that one day they will come for her. As time went on, we spoke almost every night, and she told me that her brother was being attacked by a Skinwalker. I almost didn't believe her, but I had a gut feeling by the way she looked at me that she was being serious. This was the time where I had introduced myself to her mother as her friend, and I'd regularly stayed at her place once her mum trusted me more. One night, I noticed that she was burning sage around the house, and I inquired about it. This is to ward off the evil spirits and keep skinwalkers, although she called them by their native tongue. It's just a word I can't even pronounce or spell. Skinwalkers? I asked, and she gave me a brief explanation of what exactly they were. She told me that these creatures give up what made them human to become these things and act like guns for hire and stalk out their prey. They like to play games with their victims, and they only prey on people who are afraid of them. They like to initiate their game by whistling 2 extremely loud whistles to announce their presence that way. She claimed their whistling can be heard from miles away. I called bullshit and told her nothing was going to happen to them. A few nights of them doing this nightly routine, and just one night I came over and noticed that she hadn't burnt any sage. She always did this routine at around 8 or 9 p.m, and I didn't mention any of that to her or her family, as the smell of sage always made my nose burn and made it hard to breathe. So as it was getting late and I had to get home, I said my goodbyes and took off. So when I get to the end of her street, you can see up a T-bone intersection on a small semi-main road. To the north of the road, it leads to the highway, and to the south, more neighborhoods. I live northeast from her place, so naturally when I get to the intersection, I cross the street and head north. But as I got to the end of her neighborhood, I hear it. 2 very loud, distinct whistles cut through the night and send chills down my spine. My hair all around my body, seemingly standing on end, and I tried to make out the location of the sound. It was coming from miles down the south of the road. One thought pops into my head. She forgot to burn sage tonight. Part of me wanted to think it was just an elaborate prank that she had tried to arrange, but a deep sinking feeling in the pit of my stomach told me that it was not. I quickly paced back to her house, as it wasn't that far from the end of the street, and frantically knocked on the door. It had only been about 5 to 10 minutes from when I left, so they weren't asleep yet. I tell them about what I'd just heard, and tell them to burn sage just in case. I told myself, even though it may not be real, it's better to be safe than sorry. I made my exit as they finished burning the sage and head back to the intersection. It was very late, maybe 11 or 12 on a school night, so I had to get home quickly. I speed walked across the main street, heading northeast diagonally, and right when I get onto the other side, I notice him. Just across the street was an old man. Normally, I would just play it off as another pedestrian, but this guy stuck out so much. It wasn't really how he looked or how he was dressed. It was just how he moved that struck me as odd. An old man that looked to be about 60 or 70 was moving at the pace of a 20-year-old man. I only took a glance at him for a few seconds, but in that time this man just stared at me. A deep, cold stare. His eyes wide with absolutely no expression on his face. Just a flat face, no furrowed brows, nothing. I walked slowly, keeping him just at the corner of my sight as I watched him go down towards my girlfriend's neighborhood. He kept his damn eyes glued to me as he walked, even when I already had my back to him. You think I was scared, but I wasn't. I didn't feel any fear. I was simply weirded out by his aura, or something like that. The man didn't turn into my girlfriend's street. He just continued his fast march down south, and I felt a pang of relief and brushed it off as some crazed drug addict or something like that. Time passes, and during that time, just weird shit happens at her house. No Skinwalker activity, and she continues her nightly ritual as usual. And by the time her mother brings a witch doctor to bless the home and performs a ritual to remove a ghost bone from her brother's room. From what I gather, a ghost bone is kind of like a hex or a trap. The trap is a fetish that had been held dear to a maniac spirit, and it can be almost anything, like a toy doll or a cane or something dear to a lost spirit, and then it attaches its spirit bone to the target host. I guess that not only brought the attention of a ghost, but also a damn Skinwalker. Once it was removed from him, things kind of calmed down. But this is where mentioning the school comes to play. Now, once I go north at the T-bone intersection, I hit the highway. I have to cross the highway and head east to get to my place. That would mean I'd take a quick route into the dark dirt road, or cut through an abandoned railroad track on another street that heads to my school, and from there I cut through my school to my house. I decided I didn't want to walk in the darkness and cut through the lot, and as I got to the street that led me to the school, I noticed this guy. He's heading towards me on a bike. He's very far away at the time, and I pay him no mind. As I get closer to him, I get further away from the only street light on the street. Keep in mind that the railroad dock is next to the school, so I still have to walk some distance to get to the school. I notice a sense of eeriness about him. He gave me that similar feeling to the old man. How it just weirded me out. And I caught him staring at me. The same wide-eyed look and blank face as the old man. Also, the way he was pedaling was so unnatural. He was moving at incredible speeds, almost seemed like he was moving at 20. And he covers the same distance alarmingly fast and passes by me. Same damn thing as the old man. Literally cranes his head to keep staring at me, and manages to move his bike along the curve of the road in a perfect manner, like it was almost natural to him. Thankfully, he kept on riding, and at this point I told myself to not be afraid, that if I had a tiny tinge of fear, he would most definitely come for me. I kept calm and walked to the school. Now you'd think the school was shut out by fences, but it was a very nice school that had no need to build large fences, so you could walk past the small metal gates that are set up. It was mostly used to block cars and the like from getting past. No one really vandalized either, so another reason for no large fences. Once I get halfway through the school, I hear what sounded like a bike crackling behind me. A feeling of dread sinks in. Oh crap, I whisper under my breath, and glance back but see nothing. I hurried my pace, as all I had to do was go past one large building, and then clear a field and jump the only large chain-link fence on the property. Just to give you a better perspective, the entrance I went through is a parking lot, and the path I took is somewhat of a path to allow small vehicles and maintenance trucks to drive through, where buildings with different classes strewn about from left to right, this small road winded through the whole school diagonally. Two large buildings occupied the east and west of the lot. My usual trip meant I walk between the large buildings, and I'd rather see the field and from there my home neighborhood. I remained calm as I was nearing the end of the road and got between the two buildings. As you get to them, there is a large open area with tables and chairs to eat lunch at that is not well lit out there, and it can be pretty damn creepy at night, as trees and poles can block a clear view ahead. You had to get past that from this route. Regret soon followed as I continued ahead. I should have just stayed at my girlfriend's for the night, I huffed out under my breath, rasping as I felt very nervous walking through the eating area. Then I hear tapping ahead, as if someone was tapping their knuckles or fingers on a pole. 2 taps. This guy was toying with me. "What do you want?" I yelled out in anger and annoyance to the direction of the tapping. There was no response, just silence. It was too damn quiet. Then, the most messed up thing I've ever heard in my life happens. Right behind my ear, I hear someone whisper, "Your skin," in the most horrid, raspy alien voice I've ever heard. A mixture between a small child, male and female voice. I freak and nope the hell out of there, and I sprint as fast as I can, the fastest I have ever ran in my life, and thankfully I had trained in parkour for a few months at the time, and had some decent acrobatic skills. enough to just climb and balance on fences and leap great distances. I leapt onto a table and run jumped from table to table, hearing tapping noises getting steadily closer to me. Cackling was slowly getting louder and louder as I was getting to the passage between the buildings. Once I had gotten there, the noises stopped abruptly, but I didn't dare stop to turn. I just kept going and got to the field and then made a mad dash to the only tall fence this accursed school had. Just my luck. As I cleared the distance and near my destination, I climbed that damn fence faster than I had in my life. Gotta love that adrenaline rush. Right as I got to the top of the fence, I typically lift my whole body over and toss myself over with one hand on the top rail. As I did, something bit onto my wrist that was holding my weight. I yelped and lost my balance, making the fall a pretty bad one, and that moment screwed up how my body was turned, and normally I bend at the knees to handle all the weight of the momentum, but when that happened I lost concentration. It was a pretty long fall, 8 to 9 feet. I unfortunately landed very badly and put most of my weight on one leg. I slammed onto the ground hard on my sides, and pain surged onto my right knee and the right side of my body. If it weren't for the adrenaline, I might have passed out from the pain. I lay there curled up on the ground, just feeling like it was all over, and was surely dead. Then I noticed the bite mark. It was odd because the bite felt very painful, but it wasn't that deep at all. 4 small slash marks on the underside of my wrist. I tore a piece of my shirt and wrapped my wrist and limped back to my house. Thankfully, I gained enough strength to walk the streets ahead, where the rest of the trip was uneventful. I was amazed the damn thing didn't just leap over and end my life just like that, since it could move at such incredible speeds. The story I had to make up to my parents was so much bullshit that even when they thought I told them the truth, they instead believed the lie. I can't really remember the lie. Something along the lines of, I was depressed and cut myself. That turn made me fall and hurt my leg in the bathroom whilst cutting myself. Something like that. But what I can tell you from this experience is that I was left with a whole new perspective of otherworldly beings, and that some instance of their existence is true in some way. I was not only left with a mental scar, but a permanent injury to my leg. Torn ligament had caused my knees to become what I now know as degenerative knee, which means I have signs of an arthritic joint. Well, screw that. Lesson learned. I won't take long walks at night, and always stay in the light. You never know what might be lurking in the dark. Being from the Navajo Nation, I have seen a lot of crazy shit. Anyone not from here is not likely to believe me. I have stories about skinwalkers, Kachina dolls coming to life, Bigfoot, werewolves, and some type of winged beast. But I think the most creepy is one of my skinwalker stories. It's a bit of a read, but here you go. This story takes place in the early 2000s when I was a teenager. My cousin had just had a baby, and her husband was called out for a job that would take a couple of weeks. My cousin asked if I would stay with her for the 2 weeks to help her with her baby/work around the house. I was there for a few days, and everything was pretty uneventful, until the middle of the 2nd week. At night, we would hear someone knocking on different sides of the trailer. Keep in mind the nearest neighborhood was about 5 miles away, and this continued for 3 nights in a row. The 4th night is when things take a turn for the worst. The night starts with the knocking, but it progresses to scratching. Worried that someone was trying to break in, I summoned the courage to go outside and confront whatever/whoever was messing with us. I only caught a shadow of whatever it was as it ran behind the trailer. I ran around yelling at it, "You better run because I'm going to call the cops," or something to that extent. It is so fast I couldn't believe it. As I chase it to the front of the trailer, it runs through the clothesline. This is where it gets even crazier. It runs towards the utility post and climbs up it, clutching something in its hands, and begins the most eerie laugh I've ever heard. It jumps back down, dropping whatever it was holding, and runs towards the window of the trailer, as if to peek in. My cousin was inside holding the baby. I run to the window and look, to my amazement, as it had disappeared. I run inside and tell my cousin it's gone. Needless to say, we didn't sleep well for the rest of the night. The next morning I go outside and look at the window where I had last seen it. I look at the ground and see bare footprints. However, these were no ordinary footprints. The best way I can describe them was like a human footprint with a claw, like a dog or wolf. I go to the utility pole and found what it had been clutching the night before. It was my niece's tiny little shirt. It goes without saying, we spent the next few days in the safety of my mother's home, off the reservation. I am a soldier in the US Army. I'm stationed at a base in southern Arizona. Over the weekend, some buddies and I decided to go exploring around the mountains surrounding the base. We woke up early to get started, and before long, we were well on our way up a mountain. We decided to take a break by sitting on some rocks that seemed to form benches on a large ravine. The view up there was breathtaking. We sat there for about 20 minutes catching our breath and taking it all in. Then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, we heard what sounded like a mariachi playing from behind us. I turn around, and I can best describe what I saw as an 1800s military figure with an oversized cartoon-like exaggerated Mexican head, mustache, sombrero, and all. It was awkwardly skipping towards us, like it was trying to dance. Once it got closer, we could see its flailing arms, like a poorly programmed robot attempting to play the guitar it didn't have. As it came closer, we realized the mariachi music was coming from its head, not just its mouth. The mouth, however, was forming the lyrics, but it seemed like it was out of sync, almost like what you see when your video is ahead of your audio on your TV. This thing was running right at us, but we were too intrigued to be scared. Instead, we just sat and watched, memorized. I'm not even sure what happened next. From what I saw, this thing skipped right by us and right into the ravine. And instead of falling straight down, it seemed to glitch its way down. And then as it got halfway, it literally just disappeared like a literal glitch in the Matrix. We were all just sitting there dumbfounded for a minute, when all of a sudden, we heard a girl's scream coming from the ravine. Our reaction to this is sort of hard to articulate. Being men, especially military-trained men, it is somewhat expected that we would be inclined to help a woman in need. But this wasn't that. This was different. It was almost like we were hypnotized by it. So much that we had forgotten about the completely unnatural incident that happened moments before. We all began racing down the ravine, which was extremely dangerous because of the height and extreme steepness. We didn't care. We needed to help this woman. And after leaping from rock to rock, we eventually got to the source, a small cavern opening on a ledge in the middle of the ravine. I was the first person on the ledge, so I got down on my stomach and began low crawling into the cave. I noticed immediately as I entered the cave that I could no longer hear the screaming, and I didn't care about it anymore anyway. Immediately after entering the cave, I became overcome with an unimaginable thirst. In the cave, there was a little ledge and a small lake about 20 feet below us. As I saw it, I immediately began to crawl towards it in an attempt to crawl off the ledge and into it. I wanted to drink that lake, all of it. Something was caught on my leg though, and as much as I struggled, I couldn't continue forward. After struggling for about a minute, I saw what I believed to be the most deformed mermaid I ever imagined, leap up about 20 feet from the water and come inches from my face, before suddenly falling back into it, torso first and folding backwards like a sandwich. The weirdest thing about this was the splash it created. The splash was much too big for the creature that created it, and the sound was even louder, like it was made by an over-the-top special effects crew. Immediately after this, I could feel myself being dragged back. But it was just my friends, thank God. We quickly went to the bottom of the ravine for safety. Once we knew we were in the clear at the bottom, we looked up, and the cavern was no longer there. This happened to me not too long ago. We live near an Indian reservation, and we tend to walk our dog Mabel by the reservation in the evening. It was your standard evening, and it's worth mentioning that our house on the backyard borders a forest. Mabel has been known to jump the fence many times, but tends to be a good girl and stays within the yard. This was a day where me and my husband were unable to take her for a walk. Paperwork had piled far too high, and we kept pushing off giving her a walk until later on in the day. When I finally had enough time to breathe, I went out to look for the little dog, but Mabel was nowhere to be seen. I looked all around the house and ended up in the yard, only to see no signs of her. That's when I realized she must have jumped the fence in boredom. It was starting to get dark, so I knew that I had to find her in the forest. She was a fairly obedient dog, and we trained her to come back whenever we called her name. So I yelled out Mabel, and expected to see her little body running towards me fairly quickly. However, my voice fell on deaf ears. There was nothing but the sound of wind, and so, slightly frustrated, I went back, grabbed my flashlight, jumped the fence, and started looking around to see where she was while calling her name. Perhaps she went in a little bit too far, but this was unlike her, as she was a fairly cautious dog and only rarely had these spouts of bravery. I walked through the forest, calling her name in the dimming light. I don't get any response. As I'm walking through, I hear something in the distance. It's a very light sound. It almost sounds like a creature eating. Oh man, I bet Mabel's found something to eat. Perhaps a mouse, which is always gross, as she tends to puke them up on the kitchen floor. I ran in that direction, but no sooner had I done so that the animal heard that I was approaching, and I saw it swiftly dart further into the forest. I was starting to get tired, and convinced this was my dog, just approached it slowly at a leisurely pace, but running off it kept doing. It took about 5 minutes before I finally caught up with the creature, and when I was finally getting to a point where I thought I could approach it, the sky had almost completely turned black, with the final bits of orange lingering in the sky. As I got close, I shone my flashlight. That's when I noticed that whatever this was a lot bigger than my dog. I shone my flashlight up and down, now concerned. Whatever this thing wasn't my dog. It was about 4 feet hunched over, and it was going at whatever it was eating. I was starting to get scared. Was this a coyote? I certainly didn't want to get in the way of its meal. That would definitely piss it off. Although, part of me was worried. What if it made quick work of my small dog? I don't know where it came from, but bravery somehow emerged from within me, and I picked up a stick from nearby and launched it feebly at the creature. It missed. Obviously it missed. But the sound it made alerted it, as it hadn't quite caught on that I was still keeping up with it. It looked me dead in the eyes, and then rose. This was not a coyote. It was unlike a creature I had ever seen before. It stood up on its 2 hind legs and stared at me with these cold, dead eyes. I stood there, paralyzed on the spot, and I went to pick up another stick to throw at it, but by the time I looked up, it was darting off again into the woods. I wasn't really sure what kind of animal this was, and when I went further in to investigate to see if it was munching on my dog, it wasn't. Whatever this was barely recognizable as an animal, and I decided to turn back and call it a day. Maybe Mabel had already made her way inside. Fortunately for me, my husband told me that he'd been trying to call my cell phone, but I'd left it in my office. Mabel had returned home, and everything was fine, until I went to bed that night and told him about the strange animal that I saw in the forest. He's a bit of a wildlife geek, so I started asking him what it could possibly be, as it looked quite dangerous, and I didn't know they were living behind the house. After giving him a description, he just kind of stares at me puzzled and says, "No animal should be able to do that." "What do you mean?" I say. "No animal should be able to stand up on its hind legs and then run on them. Not any that live here anyway." We started looking into it, and we found out that there's this creature called a Skinwalker from Navajo mythology. I'm not sure if this was one of them, but whatever it was, it left me very creeped out. So my friend Wallace and I have a sort of yearly tradition of taking at least one camping road trip per year. We're from LA, and we've gone to Arizona, Nevada, and more local places like Joshua Tree. And each time we've gone, it's been a positive experience, and we've come back home with a ton of new memories and inside jokes. So when I suggested to him that we take a weekend road trip, Thursday night through Sunday, to Monument Valley, Utah, he agreed, and we were both stoked. On our first road trip we ever took to the Grand Canyon, we were about to drive to Monument Valley, but we got locked in by a blizzard. So it's been a location I've wanted to go see for quite some time. Thursday night rolls around, and we're ready to take off on a 10-hour excursion through the desert. My friend drives the first 4 or 5 hours, as I have been up the previous night making preparations, and I had to work a 10-hour shift. We make it to Barstow, and decide to take a few detours. We heard of an old ghost town that was close by, and we thought we could get some cool astrophotography shots. The road to the ghost town was pitch black and really bumpy. It was 1 AM at this point, and I'm on high alert. You never really know what you'll find out in the middle of the desert. As I'm staring out of my window, I see the enormous 20-foot dark man-mass-shaped thing coming up on the side of the road, and I nearly crapped myself. But as I got closer, we realized it was just a giant sign in the shape of a gold miner, promoting the ghost town. Crisis averted. We also found an abandoned water park a few miles away, but decided not to go, as we saw some flashlights out in the distance. We hit the road again and passed through Vegas around 3:30 a.m. We never really realized how empty and dead it feels there in the wee hours of the morning. I start driving from here, and the rest of the trip until our destination was pretty uneventful. We passed a town called Colorado City, where we spotted a ton of abandoned houses and complexes, and we said to ourselves, we should check these out, but ultimately decided against it due to time constraints. We later found out that this town is full of polygamous Mormons that are hostile towards outsiders and lived in unfinished houses to avoid being taxed by the government. We even saw them at the gas station about 20 miles away from their town, and they were dressed in old 19th century clothing, and they were staring us down and giving us dirty looks. Anyway, after a long day of sightseeing and driving, we finally arrive at Monument Valley at 8 p.m. Needless to say, we were exhausted, so we set up camp and make dinner in the dark. We hadn't had a solid meal all day, and sat down to take some astrophotography. After a couple of drinks, and seeing as we are in the Native American land of the Navajo, I decide to tempt fate and ask my friend if he has ever heard the tale of the Wendigo. He said no. So I decided to tell him that the Wendigo is some sort of shape-shifting Navajo witch doctor that attacks and eats animals and people, and can then shapeshift into a person or animal. He looks mystified yet intrigued. So then, how do you spot a Wendigo? Wallace asks inquisitively. The Navajos say that the animal will look vaguely human. It'll, for instance, walk funny, have human-like features, but the definitive giveaway is that it has no tail. The Navajo are afraid of even mentioning the Wendigo, in fear that it'll call the cryptid to them. I then proceeded to tell him a few stories I read on Reddit, and some of the crazy things that some people have experienced. One of the stories I mentioned was of a Navajo man who was shooting guns near some Anasazi ruins with his cousin when they started hearing weird animal noises. The story later mentions that he encountered a black dog with no tail that gritted his teeth at him. We both sat there in silence in the arid 28-degree weather as a light breeze picked up and we heard a dog barking off a couple of miles away. We waited around to see if anything would happen, but nothing ever did. It was probably just some other campers, I assumed. Just then, I realized I had left my shutter release button for my camera in the car. I told Wallace that I would be right back and would only take 3 minutes. The car wasn't far away, but it was far enough to be out of earshot. As I was rummaging through my car, I thought I heard someone calling my name. I stopped and listened closely. Nothing. I'm probably just imagining things, I said skeptically. But as soon as I found my device, I realized that someone was calling out to me. It was Wallace. He sounded distressed. I shut the car and started running back to camp, thinking that he might have encountered some sort of rattlesnake or scorpion. But as soon as I get there, what do I find? A black dog standing before us. We looked at each other, as if expecting one of us to do something. That is when I noticed, and pointed. Look, it has no tail. I picked up a hatchet, fully expecting this thing to attack us, but it never did. It just wandered around and acted like your typical dog. We let out a sigh of relief. Dude, what happened when I left? I was just sitting here adjusting the settings on my camera, when out of the corner, I thought I'd seen a black mass moving from the shadows. Out of nowhere, I heard a strange lip-smacking sound coming from under me. sort of like when a dog licks its lips. I look down, and there's this black dog staring straight at me, and that's when I called your name. We didn't know what to do, but seeing as the dog was acting, well, as a dog should be, we left it. He ended up keeping us company the rest of the night, and being really friendly towards us. We appropriately named him Wendigo, as if we had not really learnt our lesson not to tempt fate. Then we decided to call it a night, and as we slipped into our tents, Wendigo went into one of the bushes and fell asleep there for the night. Nothing really happened the next day. We did see Wendigo again next morning, wandering around different campsites with another dog. In the light of day, we realized his face was sort of strange looking, but all in all, he just looked like a wild dog. One more thing happened on Sunday morning, which I imagine is probably unrelated, where we heard some coyotes howling and screeching, but other than that it was pretty tame. So yeah, I'm not entirely sure if this is a Wendigo story, but at the very least, it's a strange yet interesting coincidence that we can recount to our friends and family. Alright, so I've been waiting to share this story for a while now. This happened roughly 5 or 6 years ago, and while nothing actually happened, listening to these stories makes me feel like something could have. So it starts about a week prior, when my older cousin asks me to go on a camping trip with him and some other family members, my uncle and his kids. I don't like camping. I am a soft marshmallow that hates sleeping in anything other than a mattress, but he had just gotten back from Brazil, and I had missed him horribly, so I went along. The trip took almost a day to get out there. It was late in the afternoon when we finally set up our tents in a camping spot by an absolutely beautiful looking lake in the mountains. Well, I think it was somewhere in eastern Oregon. My memory sucks, so I'm not sure. Anyway, I walk down into the lake with my cousins, and they start messing about and generally being kids. While I'm admiring the view, I look down and I notice what I thought was an odd white rock. I take a closer look, and I find it's actually a bone. It looked like a vertebrae. I thought how epic it would be to bring that home, so I picked it up with the full intention of keeping it as a souvenir. It was completely clean, as if it had been out there for a long time. I wanted to keep it, but after looking it over, I started feeling odd, like something was wrong if I took it. So I decided to bury it near where I found it. The day turned to night, and we all had a blast, and I was quite glad I decided to come at this point. But when it came to sleeping, I was quickly regretting it. Regardless, I ended up falling asleep after a bit. The next thing I'm about to say is a second-hand account from my younger cousin. He wanted to stay up for a bit while everyone else was asleep, so that he could keep the fire going, when all of a sudden, as calm as can be, a wild stag walks into the camp and just stares at him. Neither my cousin nor the deer move for what felt like 15 minutes before the deer leaves. It was weird because it made absolutely no noise as it moved, but I'm not 100% because I was asleep through this. The next morning, I saw some deer in the area while I was heading to the restroom, so that was pretty cool. Nothing else really happened after that, other than when I was sleeping in the car, as I really don't like sleeping on the ground. I kept the doors locked because I had the worst feeling I was being watched. But like I said, nothing really happened after the first night, and the day we were leaving, I decided that I wanted to take the bone home as a souvenir after all, and I went to the exact spot that I buried the bone. and it was gone. No trace at all. Disappointed at the time, I headed back to the car. We stopped at one of the other campsites on the way home, to which I again slept in the car. This site was a camp/RV park. We were on one side of a busy highway, so there was a road. That night, while I was getting ready to sleep, I heard a pack of coyotes. It sounded so close, it could have been on the opposite side of the road, and it sounded like there was a lot of them. For almost an hour, I heard them yipping and barking, and I was worried sick. I knew I was safe, but my family was still in the tents. I later found out that my uncle was sitting up with the gun he had bought for most of the night because of them. But the spot wasn't that bad. I have the best memories of that trip at that spot. My uncle was showing one of the cousins to fish in the tiny stream, catch and release because it was so small. So she catches this tiny fish, and my youngest cousin, who had been watching a lot of VeggieTales at the time, yelps, "Fish slap." I look over at this poor little fish, and it goes flying through the air. The fish ended up being okay, but my uncle's horrified yell is still fresh in my mind. I love that kid. Overall, I don't regret going. I spent valuable time with my cousins' kids, and I had wonderful memories. But I do wonder, could we have come close to a Skinwalker? And I just didn't know. I didn't know about them until recently, but that deer coming to camp was just so weird. Even if it was completely comfortable around humans, but I'm sure I'm overthinking it. Right? This happened on Christmas night 2007, approximately 8:30 p.m, on a rural back road in upstate New York. It was Christmas Day. It was pleasant and festive. Opening presents early in the morning with my sisters, hearty breakfasts made by my dad, and delicious smells from the kitchen as my mum and dad prepared a feast. Visits from extended family, bringing pies and cakes for dessert. Around 2, we all sat down to eat, and then lazed about for the rest of the afternoon into the evening. This is the story. At about 8, everyone had left, and the food was all but put away for round 2 the following day. I decided to head over to visit my friend in the next village. The drive would be about 10 minutes if I took the back roads to get there, so I did. First, a little background on where my friend lived. It was a housing development surrounded by a private lake. You might call it a gated community. You could still drive through it freely after hours by entering one of 4 private entry points. Since the community was built around a lake, the road surrounding it went into a spiral sort of shape. The houses were sparsely positioned on the outermost part of the spiral road. Closest to the 4 private entry points, as you drove in further, there were a lot of other houses positioned closer together, nearer the lake. My friend lived on the outer edge of this development, so once I reached the entry point, it would only take me another few minutes until I reached his house. His house, along with all the owners, were far enough apart that you couldn't see them from the road as you drove by. There were either woods all around with long drives, or open fields with long drives. You could see porch lights on in the distance, but that was about it. As I entered the development, the speed limit dropped from 30 down to 20. There were no street lights in the development, and for some reason I never put my high beams on. I couldn't go any faster than the speed limit, because there were speed bumps placed every 30 feet or so. It was a mild night, and I remember having my driver's side window open slightly, taking in some fresh air. I remember driving in silence, which was unusual for me, as I always put music on in the background while driving. I must have just been enjoying the quietness after all the commotion of the day. I reached a section of the road that had barren fields on either side and woods set back. Houses were probably nestled back into the trees. As I drove, I noticed what looked like someone walking up ahead on the opposite side of the road, coming in my direction. Mind you, I was still going at about 20 miles per hour the whole time, so it was probably less than a minute by the time the walker came into clear view. I got a quick scan of it from my windshield before my car and it were exactly parallel, and this is what I saw. It was not a person. It stood on two long legs, with long arms hanging down from its shoulders. It was strong-looking, lean, muscular, but not beefy in stature. It looked thin at the same time, and it looked at least 7 feet tall. It was light-coloured, not sure whether it was white, tan, yellowish, or greyish. It didn't appear to have fur, but there was some texture to its skin. It wasn't smooth. There appeared to be something coming down off its back. I didn't know what it was. All I can recall about its face is the small features it had on the mouth and jaw. They were noticeably large. And it had pointed things atop of its head, two things going straight upwards with something mingled in between the two. That's when I got a quick scan, and from my observation of it, it neared my car, and my car neared it. As my car became parallel to it, within a split second, I went from looking out my windshield to looking at it from my driver's side window. In that moment, its face quickly peered down at me, and all I remember was the mouth opened wide. Out came a remarkable scream I'll never forget. It gives me the chills just thinking about it. It consisted of a high-pitched shrill shriek, enveloped by a deep guttural growl. Both sounds happened simultaneously in that scream. I kept driving all the while. This was happening so fast that I didn't even have a chance to be scared or shocked by anything. I continued driving and went past my friend's house and drove home. I called him to tell him what happened and that I just needed to get back. I was probably running on adrenaline to get home. Later on, I was in total shock after it all sunk in. Had my driver's side window been open fully, it would have touched me, or worse, taken me. I'm certain of it. To this day, I still haven't worked out what it was. Has anyone ever seen anything like this? Hey guys, it's Mort here, and thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed tonight's collection of stories. I love doing Skinwalker stories, but they are quite rare and hard to come by, so it has taken a while to pull this all together. If you liked it, it would mean a lot if you would drop a like and leave a comment with your thoughts. That always helps me out a bunch. And if you're new here, why not subscribe and hit the little bell icon to be notified every time I post. I do post every night, so just make sure to hit that bell icon to guarantee those nightly spooks. Also, if there's a story that you wish to share, it doesn't have to be a Skinwalker story, you can send it to my email or my Reddit. Info can be found in the description. Oh, something else that's pretty cool is if you want to send me stuff, I'll unbox it on my second channel, and the PO box can be found in the description. But anyway, for now guys, it's time for me to sign off. Stay awesome, and I'll see you in the next one.